On the evening of my daughter's anniversary dinner, I walked into the gilded dining hall of the Fairmont San Francisco. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, white roses floated in tall vases, and a string quartet played softly near the marble fireplace. It was a room meant to dazzle a room dripping with money. Yet within those polished walls, I was about to be made into a fool. My name is Arthur Delaney. I'm 67 years old, a retired structural engineer. For 40 years, I worked with steel and stone building bridges across rivers and towers that scraped the clouds. I raised my only daughter Emma alone after her mother passed away. 3 years ago, I poured $120,000 into her Napa Valley wedding, thinking I was giving her the dream beginning she deserved. But dreams can turn into debts of the heart. That night, as the waiters glided between tables carrying silver platters, I heard laughter from the corner, where my son-in-law, Lucien Moreau, sat with his parents, who had flown in from Lyon, France. They sipped on Chateau Margaux as if it were water. Their voices dropped lower, then rose in French words they thought I couldn't follow. Vieil imbécile inutile, Lucien's father muttered with a smirk. An old, useless fool. His wife chuckled, adding a burden on his daughter, nothing more. Lucien leaned closer, wine glass dangling from his fingers. Emma works twice as hard because of him. He has nothing left to offer the world, just dead weight in a suit. Their laughter was muffled by the clink of crystal, but it cut through me sharper than any blade. They thought I didn't understand. They thought the language of their birth was a shield. But I had spent 5 years of my career in Lyon managing projects with French architects, learning the rhythm of their tongue, as carefully as I learned the rhythm of concrete pouring. Every syllable they spoke slid into my memory with perfect clarity. I didn't move. I didn't let my face twitch. I just raised my glass as though I were too absorbed in the golden candlelight to notice. But inside I marked every insult like an entry in a ledger. Emma bustled between tables, radiant in a navy silk dress, introducing me proudly to guests as Dad, the man who built bridges for half this city. She didn't hear what her husband whispered. She didn't see the curled lips of her in-laws. That was by their design. They wanted their ridicule to be our secret. I had been underestimated before by bosses, by rivals, by life itself, but never in my own family. Sitting there, I realized something. This wasn't about wine or money or cultural pride. This was about erasing me from my daughter's story. Have you ever felt that sting, that moment when people who should respect you decide you're nothing? If you're listening right now, comment below and tell me where you're hearing this story from. I want to know how far the echoes of their laughter travel, because for me, it began in that hall under chandeliers, brighter than the stars, where 3 people believed they had caged me in silence. They didn't know the man they were mocking. They didn't know I was fluent in more than their language. I was fluent in patience, in planning, in letting arrogance write its own downfall. As dessert was served, I let the conversation float around me: wine pairings, Parisian couture, summer homes in Provence. They had built a fortress of superiority, brick by brick. But I knew something they didn't. Fortresses built on pride are always hollow inside, and one day soon I would tap the walls and watch their castle collapse. When the dinner ended, I walked out of the Fairmont into the foggy San Francisco night. The streets were damp, glistening under the street lamps. Couples hailed cabs, their laughter echoing between the buildings. But for me, the night air carried something heavier than mist. It carried the weight of words meant to crush, I drove back to Seattle in silence, the hum of the highway, my only companion. By the time I unlocked the door of my apartment, it was past midnight. The rooms greeted me with their familiar quiet shelves stacked with engineering manuals, a framed photo of Emma at age 7, holding a model bridge we built together, the maple desk, where I still paid my bills by hand. I set my keys down, pulled a worn leather notebook from the drawer, and opened it on the desk. On the first line in neat block letters, I wrote, "Remember everything." And then in French, I wrote down every insult, line by line. Vieille imbécile inutile, old fool, poids mort, dead weight, rien à offrir, nothing left to give. It wasn't anger that guided my pen. It was clarity. Each word was a transaction. Each laugh was a debt. I didn't need to raise my voice to repay it. I only needed to keep my balance sheet honest. When I closed the notebook, I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The chandelier from the Fairmont still shimmered in my mind, like a mockery of the stars. I folded my hands together, not in desperation, but in steadiness. Maybe God wanted me to hear it. I whispered into the quiet, to see their true hearts before I wasted more of mine. I've never been the type to preach, but after losing Emma's mother, faith became the ground I stood on when everything else shook. That night, I felt it again, a gentle nudge, a reminder that dignity doesn't come from defending yourself in the moment. Sometimes dignity comes from waiting patiently, faithfully, until the right door opens. I poured myself a glass of water, walked to the balcony, and looked out over the city. Seattle's skyline was dotted with lights, boats moving silently across the black water. For a moment I thought of Lion of mornings spent at cafes with engineers discussing blueprints, of evenings listening to locals banter in the very language Lucien and his parents used against me. How ironic that they believed French was their secret weapon when it was actually my hidden inheritance. I thought of Emma, my little girl, who once climbed onto my shoulders at Pike Place Market to see the fishmongers throw salmon. I thought of how proud she'd been at her wedding, glowing like the Napa Valley sun itself. She hadn't heard their words, but she would feel their influence if I stayed silent forever. That was the thought that kept me awake. This wasn't just about my pride. It was about the way arrogance poisons family roots drop by drop. I opened the notebook again, turned to a clean page and wrote, "Plan, not protest." I underlined it twice. My father used to say that engineers don't shout at walls when they crack. We study the fault line, we design reinforcements, and then we rebuild stronger than before. That was the voice I heard in my head. That was the man I wanted Emma to remember. I closed my eyes and prayed a simple prayer, "Lord, give me patience to wait and wisdom to act. Let truth carry its own weight." The fog outside thickened, wrapping the city in a gray shawl. I felt something shift inside me, not rage, not despair, but resolve. Quiet dignity, I reminded myself. Quiet, but not weak. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the sound, I knew exactly what to do. I would not confront them in anger. I would not let their mockery define me. Instead, I would let time, truth, and strategy be my answer. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't fire, it's light. And light always finds its way through cracks. 3 days after that dinner, I found myself sitting in the corner booth of a quiet cafe in downtown Seattle. The place was filled with the aroma of roasted beans and fresh pastries, but my mind was far from breakfast. I was waiting for a man who had once saved me from financial ruin 20 years ago. His name was Michael Chen, a banker whose instincts for money were as sharp as my instincts for steel. He arrived in his usual way, pressed suit, loosened tie, phone buzzing with a dozen calls he ignored as he slid into the booth. "You sound urgent," he said, setting his briefcase down. "I need eyes on a French vineyard," I replied without preamble. Michael raised a brow. "Wine, you've never been sentimental about that world." "This isn't sentiment. It's strategy." I slid the notebook across the table, the one where I had written down every insult. He flipped through the French words, the English translations, the notes I'd scribbled about Lucien and his parents. I don't need to know why he muttered, but I can guess. "They own a vineyard in Provence," I explained. "They export boutique labels to the States. I want to know how healthy their balance sheet really is." Michael leaned back, smirking. "So the engineer is ready to build something new on someone else's crumbling foundation." By noon, his team had dug through trade ledgers, distributor contracts, and filings in both France and the US. The result came through in a slim folder he handed me later that afternoon. "Arthur, you were right. They're overextended. They took a bridge loan from a California distributor last spring, short-term cash flow fix. But the covenants are strict. Interest rates jump next quarter. If they can't cover the call, the note converts to equity, and they're bleeding just enough that the math looks ugly." I flipped through the pages, numbers and percentages leaping at me like steel beams on a blueprint. This wasn't just vulnerability, it was opportunity. "What's the exposure?" I asked. $3 million. Not a huge company, but enough to hurt them badly. The distributor's already nervous, wants out. And if someone else steps in, "You mean someone like you?" I nodded. Michael's grin widened. "Then you wouldn't just be a creditor. You'd have a seat at their table." That night, back in my apartment, I opened my safe and pulled out a folder labeled Pacific Crest. It was a company I'd registered years ago in Wyoming for estate planning, little more than a shell with a tax ID. But shells can be given bones. I called Michael. Pacific Crest Holdings. That's the vehicle. Within 48 hours, papers were filed, bank accounts opened, and wire instructions prepared. I sat at my maple desk, with a Mont Blanc pen in hand, an old gift from Emma's mother, and signed the documents that would quietly shift leverage across an ocean. There was a strange calm in the act. No shouting, no slammed doors, no desperate appeals for respect. Just ink paper and the slow gravity of numbers. But this wasn't only about business. This was about reclaiming ground that arrogance thought it had stolen forever. I stood on my balcony that night looking out at the city lights shimmering like scattered jewels. The Moreaus believed power was in their language, their pedigree, their ability to sneer across a crystal glass. They were wrong. Power was in preparation. I thought of Emma again, how she had smiled across that dinner table, oblivious to the contempt around her. She deserved to see her father not as a man diminished, but as a man who still held his ground. The next step was clear. I would acquire the bridge note, then move for equity. Quietly, methodically. By the time Lucien and his parents realized what had happened, the floor beneath them would already be mine. I closed my notebook and wrote one final line before bed. Respect is not requested. It is arranged. The following week moved like clockwork. Paperwork that usually drags for months slid into place within days. Pacific Crest Holdings, once a hollow shell, was now a vessel armed with purpose. The bank account had been funded, the EIN assigned, and Michael's team had lined up the nervous distributor, ready to part ways with his bridge note. We met in a sterile office high above Market Street in San Francisco. The distributor was a man in his 50s, thin hair combed too carefully, his handshake clammy with relief. Frankly, he said, sliding the agreement across the glass table, "I just want this off my books." They're a nice family, but nice doesn't pay interest. I signed with my Mont Blanc pen initials flowing onto the page like a quiet seal. When the ink dried, the note was mine. "Congratulations," Michael said, leaning back with a grin. "You just bought yourself leverage. Or maybe a lever." But leverage wasn't enough. 2 days later, another opportunity appeared. 2 minority investors in the Vineyard, distant cousins of the Moreau family, were itching for liquidity. They had been promised growth that never came. Through Pacific Crest, I quietly bought their shares as well. Small percentages, yes, but percentages matter when the tide rises. By the end of the second week, my position was no longer theoretical. I held the bridge note, I held minority shares, and I held the right to cover the capital call looming like a storm on the horizon. I looked at the balance sheet spread across my desk, lines of numbers glowing under my lamp. It was like studying a blueprint before pouring concrete. You don't just see what's there, you see what it will become. And what it would become was clear majority. At night, I practiced a new name in the mirror. Adrien Lemaire. Smooth continental, a man who could sit across from French aristocrats without flinching. Michael prepared embossed business cards. Adrien Lemaire, partner, Pacific Crest Holdings. The lettering was black on ivory stock, understated but undeniable. I wasn't just preparing for a transaction. I was preparing for a stage. Have you ever sat at a table where people thought you were invisible, only to imagine the moment you'd return and every eye would finally see you? If you're still with me to this point, comment 1 down below so I know you haven't lost the thread of this story. Because the thread is about to pull tight. By the 3rd week, the capital call arrived. New tanks, bottling lines, U.S. compliance upgrades, an ambitious expansion plan the Moreaus could not finance. Their elegant signatures declined politely. Pacific Crest answered in full. And just like that, ink turned into power. I stared at the new cap table Michael emailed me that night. 52.1%. Majority. The vineyard that had been their pride, their inheritance, their fortress, it now rested in my hands. But it wasn't triumph I felt. It was steadiness. I closed my eyes and thought of Emma again, of her laughter when she was 12, and we planted a young maple tree in our backyard. That tree still stood today, taller than the roofline, its roots deep and unshakable. That's what I wanted this to be, not destruction, but roots firm enough to remind everyone where strength truly comes from. I picked up one of the cards, Adrien Lemaire, Pacific Crest Holdings, and slipped it into my wallet. Soon that name would arrive on their doorstep, elegant and polite. Soon they would open a letter and discover that the man they mocked in French had rewritten the language of their future. The plan was complete. The stage was set. The next move wasn't financial anymore. The next move was personal. On a rainy Thursday evening, the private dining room at the Ritz-Carlton Seattle glowed with soft amber light. White linens stretched across the table like a blank canvas waiting for a story to be painted on it. Crystal glasses sparkled, a bottle of Burgundy breathed quietly in a decanter. and the hum of the city outside felt muffled by the thick glass walls. I arrived 15 minutes early. That's the habit of an engineer: arrive before the weight is set, make sure the beams align the foundation sound. Tonight the foundation wasn't concrete. It was silence. At my place setting sat a folded card, Monsieur Adrien Lemaire. My new name, my new role. The waiter poured a glass of wine I didn't touch. I wanted the table clear, the stage quiet. The door opened. Pierre and Madeleine Moreau entered first, their posture sharp, as if the very air should bow to them. Pierre wore a tailored navy suit, Madeleine dripped with pearls that whispered their expense. Behind them came Lucien, forced smile plastered across his face, his arm linked with Emma's. My daughter's eyes searched the room, caught mine, and for a flicker she frowned, confused, uncertain. They froze when they saw me standing. "Good evening," I said calmly, my voice carrying in the hush of the room. "Please sit." Pierre blinked, his polished certainty cracking. "Arthur," he said, voice low, disbelief cutting through the French accent. I gave a slight smile. "Tonight I am Adrien Lemaire, partner of Pacific Crest Holdings, majority investor in your vineyard." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rain tapping against the windows. Lucienne laughed too loudly. "This is some kind of mistake." Without a word, I slid a folder across the table. Inside the cap table, the signed transfer agreements, the bridge note converted. Cold numbers, black and white. Pierre's hand trembled as he opened it. His eyes darted back and forth, reading the lines, once then again, as if repetition could change arithmetic. Madeleine's knuckles whitened around her clutched lips, pressed tight. Emma whispered, "Dad, what is this?" I turned to her gently. "It's the truth, Emma. The truth written on paper." Then for the first time that night, I switched languages. In French, clear and fluent, I said, "Vous m'avez traité d'imbécile inutile. Ce soir, c'est vous qui voyez qui tient la vérité. You called me a useless fool. Tonight you see who holds the truth." Lucien's smile died without a sound. Madeleine's face drained of color. Pierre closed the folder slowly, as if shutting the lid on his own coffin. The waiter arrived awkwardly with the first course lobster bisque in porcelain bowls, but no one touched it. The air had shifted. The Moreaus had built a fortress of superiority, but in one stroke the floor beneath them had moved. Emma's breath caught. "Lucienne," she said sharply, turning to her husband. "Is this why you told me not to invite Dad to the investor meetings? Because you knew?" Lucienne stammered. I was protecting the tone, the image, protecting yourself." She cut in her voice, trembling but strong. I stayed calm. Engineers know when to apply pressure and when to let gravity do the work. Tonight, gravity spoke for me. I lifted my glass, finally tasting the burgundy. It was smooth, layered, and commanding like truth itself. I set it down carefully. "Tonight we eat," I said quietly. "Tomorrow we work. Decide who you want to be by morning." The silence that followed was heavier than steel. The bisque cooled in front of us untouched. The chandeliers above flickered like they knew a verdict had already been delivered. For the first time since that humiliating dinner weeks ago, I wasn't the old man sitting quietly while others mocked. I was the one who had arranged the room so truth had weight. And tonight, it crushed them. The silence in that private dining room was the kind that presses down on your chest, heavier than any weight I'd ever measured in steel. For years I had built bridges to withstand earthquakes, towers to face the wind, but nothing in my career matched the tremor that ran through that room when truth landed like a verdict. Pierre closed the folder with trembling fingers, as if by shutting it, he could erase the words printed inside. Madeleine clutched her pearls, her eyes darting between me and her son, searching for some escape. And Lucien, my son-in-law, the man who had mocked me in the language of his fathers, looked like a boy who had finally realized the test he'd never studied for had already begun. Emma sat beside him, her eyes wet not from wine or laughter, but from something harder. Betrayal. She turned to me, voice quiet, broken. "Dad, is it true you own everything?" I didn't rush to answer. I wanted her to see not just the paper, but the man behind it. I folded my hands calmly, then said, "I don't own everything, Emma. I own enough. Enough to show them that mocking kindness has consequences." Lucien slammed his fist against the table, silverware rattling. "You think this makes you strong? You humiliate us like this in front of my parents, my wife." His anger didn't move me. Anger is a fire that burns quick and wild. I had chosen a different fire, the kind that refines metal, the kind that shapes character. I leaned forward, my voice steady, my French deliberate. "La force ne vient pas des moqueries. Elle vient de la vérité." Strength doesn't come from mockery. It comes from truth. Pierre flinched, as if hearing me in his own tongue stripped away his armor. I looked at Emma, then at all of them. You thought I was silent because I was weak, but silence can also be strength. I didn't confront you at the first insult because some lessons are not taught with words. They are taught with patience and with faith. Madeleine finally spoke, her voice thin. "This is not how business is done." I almost smiled. "No, this is exactly how it's done. On paper, in daylight, with memory." I paused, then let my voice soften. "And with God as my witness." Their eyes flickered at the word God, but I didn't say it for them. I said it for myself. You see, I had prayed in the quiet of my apartment after that humiliating dinner. I had asked the Lord not for vengeance, but for clarity. Not for the ruin of my enemies, but for the chance to stand without shame. And here I was, standing taller than I had in years, not because I had destroyed them, but because truth had finally taken its seat at the table. Emma wiped her eyes. "Lucien, did you know about this?" Lucien stuttered. I knew he was planning something, but I didn't think." "You didn't think he could." She snapped, her voice breaking through the tension like glass shattering. "You've been laughing at him, treating him like some relic while he's the one carrying us all." Her words cut deeper than mine ever could. For the first time, Lucien looked small. I reached for my glass, finally drinking the burgundy that had sat untouched. The taste was bold, layered, alive. It reminded me of mornings in Lyon, of long afternoons on the Garonne, of conversations in French cafes, where I first learned that language is more than words, it's respect. I set the glass down, then spoke once more, this time softly. "Maybe God didn't silence your laughter that night because he wanted me to hear it. Maybe he wanted me to know who you truly were. And maybe he wanted me to answer not with rage but with truth. Because truth in the end carries more fire than anger ever could." Pierre's face sagged. Madeleine lowered her eyes, and Lucien pressed his palms into the linen as though bracing against a storm. Emma's hand reached across the table, fingers brushing mine. "Dad," she whispered. I'm sorry. I shook my head. No, Emma. You don't apologize for their choices. You only decide what you'll do with the truth now that it's in front of you. The waiter returned awkwardly with the main course roast duck glazed with honey and rosemary. But the plates might as well have been empty. No one touched them. Appetite had no place in a room where pride had just been stripped bare. I leaned back, letting the quiet work for me. I had said enough. The numbers, the papers, the faith behind it all, they would speak longer than any speech. For years they thought they could diminish me with whispers. But whispers have no weight when God has already written the truth. That night in the Ritz-Carlton's golden light, I wasn't just a father defending his dignity. I was a man refined by fire, steady in faith, and unwilling to let arrogance write the last word of my story. And as the rain hammered harder against the glass, I felt something stronger than triumph. I felt peace. 2 days after that dinner, I heard a knock at my apartment door. It was early evening, the sun dipping low over Puget Sound, the sky painted in streaks of orange and violet. I opened the door, and there stood Lucien Moreau, sharp suit, pressed hair, perfectly combed shoes, polished like mirrors. He looked less like a son-in-law and more like a salesman come to close a deal he'd already lost. Arthur! He began stepping inside without waiting for my invitation. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. We need to talk. I didn't move from the entryway, do we? He exhaled through his nose, setting his briefcase on the side table as if planting a flag. Look, you made your point. Congratulations. But you don't belong in this. You've embarrassed my parents, you've rattled Emma, and you've complicated everything. So here's my proposal, sell your position. I'll make sure you walk away clean with a premium. No one needs to know. I studied him for a long moment. The arrogance was still there, but thinner now, stretched like a mask, ready to tear. This isn't about premiums, Lucien. It's about principles. He flinched at the word. Principles don't pay dividends. Families do. No, I said calmly. Principles make families possible. Without them, everything collapses just like bad concrete. His jaw tightened. If you stay, you'll blow up the family. Emma will resent you. My parents will never forgive you. Is that what you want, to stand at the ashes of something you destroyed? Before I could answer, a voice came from the kitchen doorway. Is that the plan? Lucy and Emma stood there. Her hair pulled back, eyes steady, a dish towel still in her hands. She had been listening the whole time. Lucian spun around, hands up, as if caught in headlights. Emma, I was trying to protect us. This is business, not personal. Her voice trembled, but her words cut like a blade. You mocked my father in front of your parents. You lied to me about his place in this family. And now you call that business. Lucian softened his tone, reaching for her hand. I was safeguarding our image. Investors respect a certain tone, a certain respect, she snapped, pulling her hand away. Respect isn't tone, Lucian. It's truth. And the truth is, you've been using me, using my father's money, and treating us both like ornaments in your perfect little picture. He tried again, desperate now. Emma, don't do this. We have a life, a house, plans. She shook her head slowly. You already did this. The night you decided mocking was easier than respecting. Lucian looked back at me, his eyes searching for the weak old man he still hoped I was. But I stayed silent, my hands at my sides, letting Emma's words carry the weight. Finally, he grabbed his briefcase, his voice hardening. You'll regret this, both of you. You think you've won, but you've fractured everything. Emma didn't flinch. No, Lucienne. You fractured it. We're just choosing not to live inside the cracks anymore. He stood frozen for a second, then turned and walked out, not slamming the door. No, he was too careful for that. He left it closing slowly behind him, as if dignity could be measured in decibels. The apartment was quiet again. Emma leaned against the door frame, shoulders trembling. I walked over and placed a hand on her arm. "Dad," she whispered, "I can't go back. Not right now. Maybe not ever." I nodded. "Then stay here, Emma. This is still your home." She leaned her head against my shoulder, just as she had when she was a child, frightened by thunderstorms. Only this time the storm wasn't outside. It was inside the walls she'd been living in. For the first time in years, my apartment didn't feel empty. It felt like a refuge. And as night fell, I realized that the aftermath of truth isn't ruin. It's clarity. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds of my apartment, softer than usual. For years, mornings had been quiet affairs, black coffee, the hum of the radio, me staring at blueprints I no longer needed. But that morning, I wasn't alone. Emma sat at my kitchen table, hair tied loosely, still wearing the sweatshirt she'd pulled from an old box in the closet. She had cleared a space beside her and stacked a pile of photo albums there, some yellowed with time. When I walked in with 2 mugs of coffee, she looked up and smiled faintly. "I forgot you still had these," she said, flipping open an album. There we were, her as a child in overalls, me in my work boots holding the model bridge we built together for her school fair. I set her mug down. I kept everything that mattered. She traced a finger across the photo. I used to think Lucienne kept me safe. But last night I realized safety isn't in control or appearances. It's in truth. Her words hit me harder than any insult Lucienne had ever thrown. My daughter had finally seen what I'd been waiting for her to recognize all along. We spent the morning sorting through albums, laughing at her childhood drawings, remembering her mother's favorite recipes scribbled in the margins of old cookbooks. The apartment, once too quiet, now echoed with life again. By afternoon, Emma grew serious. She closed the album, folded her hands, and looked at me with eyes steady. "Dad, I don't want to just walk away from Lucian. I want to walk toward something. I've been thinking, I want to go back to school, or law maybe, or business with a legal focus. I want to learn how to stand on my own to protect myself and people like you from men like him." I studied her face. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was a woman ready to rebuild her own foundation. "That's not a dream, Emma. That's a plan," I said. "But school's expensive," she whispered. "I don't want to burden you again." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Emma, I became the majority owner of a French vineyard without leaving this kitchen. Do you think tuition scares me?" Her eyes softened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw hope there. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the city together. At the bookstore, she picked out a contracts guide and a French memoir. At the stationery shop, I bought her a leather notebook, the kind meant for plans rather than regrets. That evening, back in the apartment, we cooked together simple food pasta with garlic and herbs eaten hot and fresh. After dinner, we stepped out onto the balcony. The sky was streaked with pink, the city lights flickering on below. Emma leaned against the railing. "Dad, do you ever think about what Mom would say if she were here?" I nodded slowly. She'd tell us to stop staring at the cracks and start laying new stones. Emma smiled faintly. Then let's lay them. She set the leather notebook on the table, opened it to the first page, and wrote in neat letters, "Begin again." I watched her write, pride swelling in my chest. For years I had thought my role as a father was fading, that my usefulness was slipping into silence. But now, sitting beside my daughter as she mapped out her future, I realized something else. A father's strength doesn't end when the children grow. It only changes form. That night, as the city quieted, Emma and I sat shoulder to shoulder, our mugs of tea warming our hands. For the first time in a long while, I felt the ground beneath me was solid again. The cracks were still there, but we weren't afraid of them anymore. We were building on top of them, stone by stone. And this time the foundation would hold. The following week, I sat at my desk in Seattle, laptop open, papers spread neatly across the maple wood. On the screen, a virtual board meeting of the Vineyard flickered to life, faces of executives, accountants, and advisors, most of them still stunned by the new reality. "Let's bring this meeting to order," I said, my voice calm, even. Pierre was there, stiff in his chair. Madeleine by his side, her expression carefully neutral. Lucien hovered off camera, his presence more ghost than authority now. They all knew what the documents in front of them said: Pacific Crest Holdings, 52.1%, control. I scrolled through the agenda. First item, financial controls. Independent audits moving forward. Transparency in all U.S. dealings. No one objected. They couldn't. Second, compliance. U.S. expansion must meet federal import regulations. No shortcuts. Still silence. Third, community investment. A scholarship fund for agricultural students in Provence and Oregon. 10% of net profit beginning this fiscal year. That one drew murmurs. Pierre frowned. "That is unnecessary," he said in halting English. I switched to French, steady and deliberate. La prospérité sans partage n'est pas prospérité. Prosperity without sharing isn't prosperity. Pierre lowered his gaze. The motion passed. As the meeting went on, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not revenge, but restoration. The Vineyard wasn't just an instrument of leverage anymore. It was a structure being rebuilt with new beams, new weight distribution, new purpose. When the meeting ended, I closed the laptop and looked up. Emma stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a proud smile on her face. "You sounded like you've been running companies your whole life," she said. I chuckled. "Engineering isn't so different. Numbers, structures, pressure points. You just have to know where to apply force." She stepped inside, setting a notebook on my desk. "I've been taking notes. Contracts, compliance, governance. I want to learn." I handed her a pen. "Then start here. Draft the minutes from today's meeting. Accuracy is everything." She sat down, flipping open the notebook, her handwriting neat and determined. Watching her at my desk, I felt something shift. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was becoming our work, our future. That evening, we walked to a nearby cafe. Emma carried her notebook. I carried the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. We sat by the window, steam rising from our mugs, and talked about timelines, classes she might take, and the possibility of her interning with a law firm once she enrolled. For the first time in years, her dreams weren't abstract wishes tossed into the wind. They were plans on paper, steps on a ladder she was ready to climb. "Dad," she said softly, "I was scared you'd use this to destroy them. But you didn't. You used it to set things right." I looked at her, my daughter, who had once believed her husband's Polish was strength, now learning that true strength doesn't shout, it steadies. Destruction is easy, I told her. Restoration takes patience. And patience is what God gave me that night when I chose silence over anger. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled. Then let's restore together. We left the cafe as dusk fell, the city lights reflecting on the wet streets. Emma walked beside me, notebook tucked under her arm, determination in her stride. I realized then that the vineyard, the board meetings, the signatures, they were only part of the story. The real restoration was happening here between a father and his daughter, and as the night deepened, I knew that whatever storms lay ahead, we had already laid the strongest foundation of all truth, dignity, and the will to build again. Weeks passed. The vineyard in Provence adjusted to its new reality, financial audits in place, compliance enforced, new policies etched into the company's daily rhythm. There were grumbles, of course. Pierre sent polite but clipped emails, Madeleine withdrew into silence, and Lucien faded into the background, his voice quieter with every meeting. But I didn't measure victory by their discomfort. I measured it by something far more personal, the way Emma sat across from me at the kitchen table each morning. Notebook open, pen ready, eager to learn. One evening, after a long board call, she brought 2 mugs of tea to the balcony. The maple tree outside swayed in the wind, its leaves beginning to turn gold. She sat beside me, leaning her shoulder against mine. "Dad," she said quietly, "for a long time I thought respect was something Lucien's world gave you through money, appearances, approval. But you've shown me it's not given at all. It's earned, and sometimes reclaimed." I stared out at the horizon, the last light fading. Respect isn't just earned, Emma. It's remembered. People can forget your worth for a season, but God doesn't. He let me carry that silence long enough to prove that truth never bows to mockery. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I want to build a life that remembers that. The words settled in my heart like a blessing. A week later, Emma enrolled in evening classes at the University of Washington. Law foundations, business ethics. She came home each night buzzing with new terms, new concepts, and she shared them with me as if we were equals in discovery. I listened, corrected when I could, encouraged always. The vineyard's quarterly reports arrived crisp and clean for once. Profits stabilized, debts under control. For the first time, scholarships were issued, 5 students in Provence, 3 in Oregon, each letter of acceptance a seed planted in soil richer than any vineyard row. That night, I prayed again. Not for revenge, not for more control, but in gratitude. Gratitude that patience had borne fruit, that dignity had found its way back into my house, that my daughter was no longer walking in the shadows of arrogance. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever carried the sting of someone laughing at you behind your back, believing you were powerless? If you have, then you know those moments can either break you or build you. For me, they built me, because I chose not to answer with rage, but with resolve. Not with fire meant to scorch, but with light meant to reveal. And maybe that was God's plan all along. To remind me that the greatest strength isn't in shouting down your enemies. It's in letting the truth speak when the time is right. Emma's laughter filled my apartment again. Not the polite laughter she once practiced at Lucien's side, but real, unguarded joy. I hadn't heard that sound in years. It was better than any dividend, any title, any victory. On a quiet Sunday morning, she handed me a piece of paper, her first essay for class. At the top, she had written a line that stopped me cold. Dignity is not a gift to be received. It is a foundation you lay for yourself, stone by stone. I folded the paper carefully and said, "That's your mother's wisdom shining through you." Emma smiled. "No, Dad. It's yours. And now it's mine, too." I looked at her pride swelling, knowing that whatever storms might come, she was no longer the woman who once stood silently beside a man who mocked her family. She was stronger now. We both were. And as the autumn wind rustled the maple leaves outside, I realized something. The greatest legacy I could leave wasn't ownership of a vineyard, or wealth or policies written in French and English. The greatest legacy was the quiet lesson that truth, patience, and faith will always stand when arrogance falls. So if this story has touched you, if it's reminded you of your own strength, I ask you share it with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to follow this channel for more grandpa stories of dignity, resilience, and triumph. Because sometimes the most powerful victories aren't shouted from the rooftops. They're whispered in silence and proven in time. And tonight, as I turned off the lamp and let the quiet of my home settle around me, I smiled. Not because I had won, but because I had remembered who I was. So if this story has touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to follow this channel for more grandpa stories of dignity, resilience, and triumph. Because sometimes the most powerful victories aren't shouted from the rooftops. They're whispered in silence and proven in time.